Chapter 5 Meeting with Fragments. The dissociated psyche and fragmented identities are dissimilar. The dissociated psyche is split on several personalities. The alter psyches are not connected and are in the process of disassociating from the past life events. The disassociation can be the result of narcotics or genetics and occurs when the psyche was in an extreme situation and was unable to handle the stress. When the trauma is very strong and happened to a fragile psyche, the psyche got completely disassociated and did not know about the existence of the others. In the previous frame of reference, the operating system of the psyche saw the circumstances as insurmountable. In an effort to survive, our psyche is organizing the new independent structures with dissimilar frames of references. There are the new sets of norms, values, and ideas that affect the interactions. Each alternative character is fragmented, but within the personality, its fragments are not disassociated. In the process of organizing a disassociated psyche, some fragments are loosely associated, but others may be interpreted and clearly present fabricated events from a nonconforming viewpoint. The new system is completely distinct and allows us to continue to do what was previously impossible. Perhaps our original character was a victim, but the new alter ego is a villain. Our disassociated structure is falsifying knowledge of the past, which is not congruent with real facts, and it uses uncommon approaches. Our personalities may not have any shared memory and can lose access to life events, including weddings and sexual interactions. Sometimes alter ego personalities are aware that the other had sex or got married, but because of loose associations, they are separated from feelings about the event. Sometimes they are aware that the other fragments of the personality are around and sharing the same physical body. People with multiple personalities have unique psyches. Even they exist without any involvement in the lives of others' personalities. Usually the personalities have no communication, but sometimes they do have a little interaction. The fragments of every personality are parts of one identity and share the same memory base. The fixated fragments are in the process of rearranging their connections. They are unstable and produce a fragmented identity. They have access to the current life events but produce inadequate responses. Our psyche can be taken over by fixated responses, which produce restricted responses on distinct life events. They continue to use the same dysfunctional and persistent patterns, and they are the parts that were left over from other experiences. They fight to take over responses from other events because they want to dominate in order to save us and to go after the entire psyche. They associate with the repetitive responses and react again and again as if the traumatic event has reoccurred. When they take over, they confine our psyche to the predictability of responses. They can act as a result of the learned behavior as well as the inheritance. When the events are not fearful, they exhibit fears anyway and repeat the fearful responses. Our psyche survives the trauma by restructuring our previous responses. The first defense happens when our fears do not go away. We believe that at any time we can have the trauma again. It is one of our learned defenses. Our fears become a domineering reaction and suppress our other responses, becoming the center of our identity and continuing to repeat the fearful responses. As a result of trauma, we live in constant fear. The second learned defense disregards the previous sufferings and denies the fact that the traumatic experience ever existed. The denial of the trauma makes us reckless and we ignore safety precautions. The reckless behavior can spread to other areas of our life, and very soon we are in danger of another trauma. The previous functioning becomes impossible because the stress is unbearable. The psyche needs to survive somehow. To save ourselves, so we disassociate to a character that does not remember our past but somehow has fragments and continues to function. Dissociation from oral and visual memory. Our amnesic disorder has its origin in losing contact with oral and visual memory. During amnesia, our psyche is disassociating from previous visual and oral experiences. It has a blockage to the part of the memory where needed information is stored. Our psyche has restricted access to areas with information about our past, and the restriction may be the result of physiological, emotional, psychosomatic, or substance-induced processes. Our access to the database is locked, and the loss of memory may be voluntary or involuntary. When we experience something bizarre, then our voluntary restrictions have begun. Our psyche possibly did not accept that we committed a crime or saw some other terrible action. Our involuntary restriction happens when we become a target of brutal environmental or organic conditions. When our psyche experiences a strong trauma, as a defense, we can experience amnesia. When we are poisoned or injured, we can develop amnesia, experiencing blockages to the access of the traumatized memory. When our memory comes back, we view again the memory's data, but see our past distinctly. Our lowest level of access is represented by the loose associations and memory lapses. We appear confused because of blockages in access to our memory. For our protection, the psyche creates a fictitious memory. When our fragments become more flexible, we do not need protection from the past anymore and require full access to our data. Our atypical level of fragmentation or reaction to the traumatic event may have a genetic underlining. The psyche has diverse responses to stress. Some psyches stay solid, others get fragmented, and still others become amnesiac and disassociated. The answer is in the genetic organization of our psyche. When we regularly use alcohol, we risk becoming alcoholics. Not everyone who consumes alcohol becomes dependent on it. One of the factors behind the chemical dependency is an imbalance in the brain's chemical. Our addiction is also the result of the presence of fixated fragments that are taking over our psyche, limiting our accesses to the learned memory and forming our fixated and repetitive responses. The fragments suppress our common senses, and as a result, we overlook previous unpleasant experiences. In the psychological or physiological infatuations, we see the process of fragmentation. By being far away from the object of our infatuation, we can be very reasonable and talk sensibly and sincere about the wrongs of our infatuation. The rigid fragments can cause detachment from our learned memory. Psychological addiction depends on our brain chemistry. In the same way as chemical dependence, some of us stop gambling before big losses, but others continue to put money on the gain. If we suffer from an addiction, we do not make the right choices. In the casino, our common sense is left at the door. Our fragments that represent our common sense are replaced by fixated fragments that seem loose and detached from our common sense. The change in our attitude is very sudden, and sometimes it's impossible to believe we are the same people. We choose to ignore our previously learned memory. Our psyche does not provide an access to our common sense, and we have blocks against retrieving needed information. Behind our psychological addiction is amnesia. We detach from our learned oral, visual memory and leave them to the control of our kinesthetic urges. Gambling has both physiological and psychological roots. In the same way as alcohol and drugs, gambling addiction can have genetic roots. At first look, gambling appears to be a psychological addiction. The separation of our psychological and chemical addictions helps us to deal with each of them separately. This way, we have more understanding of the process of addiction to address in its treatment. The physiological part is clearer when we deal with the psychological. The roots of our psychological addictions are in the inability to have congruence in our responses. We can have more than one psychological addiction, but the roots of them are in the incongruence of our responses. The need for congruence is based on our drive for unification. We split and cannot live without any pretensions. When we are addicts, our fragmentation is very visible, and our responses include denials and promises that we are not planning to fulfill. We lie to everyone without any remorse and cannot be trusted. Treatment is successful when we take our addiction under our conscious control. Consciously, we must meet our fragments by their responses and deal with them. We can identify and have a dialogue with any of our fragments. When our fragments stop lying and pretending, real dialogue becomes possible. Right away, it is possible to achieve real dialogue between our fragments. As a temporary intervention, we can negotiate. The process of identifying fragments as our goal and building an atmosphere for honest dialogue is time-consuming. To stop our pretensions and our desire to deceive, we need time. We must unify a majority of our fragments and have congruent responses. The unified fragments characterize our identity, and our real dialogue is the healing factor. Our psychological addiction is a result of our fragmented psyche. Our strong and aggressive fragments cover the hopeless and helpless. The main purpose of the fragments in the gambler's structure is the protection of his psyche. The fragments preserve the appearance of functionality and the presence of the congruence of the expression. Many of our fragments are weak and damaged, and other fragments cover up for them. In diverse psyches, we have dissimilar structural organizations, but in all of them, the more functional fragments cover for the dysfunctional of the damaged fragments, which display a lot of pretension and stubbornness. Our damaged fragments do not function properly, and as a result, we have incongruence in our responses and lose to the gambling addiction. We cover up our imperfection and are involved in the process of pretension. Our pretension is an attempt to keep together our fragmented psyches. We want to be together despite the stress and the struggles. Pretension protects us from admitting that we are losers. The gambling addiction is a result of incongruence in translation of our kinesthetic, oral, and visual stimulation. When we sit at the card table and play cards, we feel a nudge to leave, but we stay instead. When we lose, we have some expectations that our luck will change for the better. When we are winning, we have the feeling that the luck will continue forever. Because of faulty assumptions, we are disregarding our oral messages, like the one that gambling is unpredictable and that luck changes. Eventually, we lose more than we win, and we become losers. However, when we are not losing too much, we are more congruent in our oral, visual, and kinesthetic responses. Nevertheless, we still do not have the strength to leave the card table. As typical gamblers, we are pretenders and do not leave a table when we endure a significant loss. We do not accept our visual imperfection and feel insecure, unattractive, and unpopular. We do not admit to being unlucky and continue gambling despite significant losses. Our gambling addiction reflects the incongruence between oral, visual, and kinesthetic modes, and we become gambling addicts because we pretend that we love the self, but really we do not love. When we do not have the strength to admit the visual, kinesthetic, and oral imperfections, we become a target and can be converted into an addicted gambler. Just like businessmen who are not able to admit their mediocrity or middle-aged people who have lost their sexual attractiveness, we are not admitting to reality. We get on a shaky road to be losers in gambling. We lay bets despite heavy losses. When we cover our natural face with a mask of pretension, we are at great risk of becoming losers. If we are victims of illnesses of depression, attention deficit, obsessive compulsion, and impulsivity, we are at high risk of becoming fascinated with gambling and its atmosphere of unstable emotions. In many instances, gambling is our substitute for sexual satisfaction. Our sexual dissatisfaction can be an echo of prior sexual abuse or another psychological or physiological injury that prevented us from future sexual pleasure. Gambling provides us with a needed emotional discharge. Our desire to get satisfaction can be strong enough to forget our common sense and to do foolish things. Our drive for gambling is comparable to the strong desire to be around our sweetheart. It is our love affair. In both instances, we have a yearning for the satisfaction and to be real without any pretensions. Gambling addiction is a masqueraded attempt to love the self and to be real. The life of pretension brings us to gambling, which is self-medication in the same way as alcohol and drugs. By dealing with gambling addiction, we explore our desire to escape from the splitting of our psyche. Addicted gamblers continue to play despite the reality of losing everything. The most amazing conduct for us as addicted gamblers is our unchangeable belief that bad luck will miraculously change and that our winnings will recover our losses. The fragment that believes in winning is united with our neutral fragments. The brain supplies us with a chemical cocktail that keeps us believing in our good fortune and motivates us to continue gambling. Our impulsiveness takes over and suppresses our more reality-oriented fragments. Our brain has a task to keep us gambling in a losing game and to constantly release the same cocktail of chemicals. The chemical combination is similar to the one we have when we are winning. Addicts do not feel any change. We do not adjust to special circumstances, and the desire to win suppresses all other opinions. Our motivation is stronger than our common sense. The act of vigilance contributes nothing to justice, but can help retain an illusion of fairness. As a result, at the end, we hurt the self more than others. We cannot understand that when the psychological trauma is hurting so much, the act of vigilance will not help. The pretension continues despite any common sense. The gambling helps us to forget about trauma. Our gambling is our self-medication and helps to prevent disassociation, keeping our fragments together. As a result of gambling, our vigilance decreases, and our vigilant feelings are usually the result of abuse and post-traumatic stress. Our flashbacks of abuse and the effect of those flashbacks reproduce the feelings of the traumatic event. For us, gambling is associated with a desire to have a congruent visual experiences, and our fragments get connected to visual stimulations. Our gambling is a deception, a chimera, a farce. Our desperate minds believe in this illusion. Underneath, we pretend that we can somehow return back to the traumatic experience and change it to our advantage. In reality, the gambling takes us far away from the trauma. Somehow it protects us from becoming vigilantes. It offers a false impression of congruence between visual, oral, and kinesthetic stimuli, granting us with escape. We pretend that we are keeping the self in balance and are preventing disassociation. We are potential gamblers when we feel guilty without any offense or suffering from intense feelings of culpability. The punishing fragments gamble on the big bets, and we honestly believe that we have a winning card. The big bet needs to have a desired winning. We punish the self by avoiding playing minimal bets. As soon as we win some money, we put all the money back into the pool for the next bet. If we win on the small bet, we would feel guilt and hate ourselves for not playing big. We are not afraid of losing a game. We are scared that instead of getting a maximum win, we will win too little. When we are scared, we can become addicted gamblers. The internal pressure of our fear and the desire to prove in the world the opposite creates a very aggressive fragment that pushes us to play recklessly when it is not reasonable. It encourages us to make irrational bets and to take part in the high rollers games when it is obviously that we do not have the required qualifications. We can easily be addicted to gambling if we feel angry and intimidate others. Our biggest self-deception is in belief that by instilling fears in others, we can insulate the self from a victim's role. Gambling creates the illusion that we are protected. It helps us to express our emotions. The pretension is one of our desperately invented tools to resist emotional trauma. We subconsciously know what is right and what is wrong, but we pretend anyway. We talk about casinos as an evil, but we gamble during all of our free time. The need to pretend has a base in our crippled structure. It shows everyone that our fragments are in disarray. The pretension dominates our oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory functions. The sexually abused victims have a fragment that is very sensitive to kinesthetic stimuli and touch. They overreact to touch, and the kinesthetic fragment activates their alarm system, making them uptight and tense. Our alarm system can influence us to be hyper and arrogant. We are very sensitive to our visual stimuli. As victims of violence, we struggle when we see hostility on TV and in the movies. We resist giving up our images of revenge. Our flashbacks are the images of abuse, and the chemical released is unconfined and can get out in unpredictable situations. When we are gamblers or traveling to a casino, our fragments agree to gamble, but only a few have a real problem. Our psyche can have diverged fragments. It can be a representation of an old or a young woman or a man at different ages. The man may gamble often, but he comes to the casino only because his family is coming. Another man is asexual. He is impotent and has a lot of fears in him, so he plays unreasonably and loses a lot. But he is in casino to prove himself that he is not a coward. One woman comes because she has a gambling addiction. She's addicted and releases her deep bitterness. She really believes that she can beat the odds of the game. All of our fragments can be gamblers, but only a few influence others to gamble, and we cannot be persuaded to stop gambling. It is impossible to stop us from coming to the casino because our fragments agree to gamble. The spokesman of the psyche is one fragment with a psychological addiction. When other fragments bring some convincing evidence against gambling, the spokesman ignores them. Influence from the outside is not too effective with our inside structure. The best way to reach our fragments is by getting them engaged in internal dialogue, which will help restructure our feelings about the self and others. An old woman goes gambling because she does not want to be alone at home. She is always winning because she never gets involved emotionally in the gambling. The gambling for her is not a problem, and she would not gamble if she had something else to do. She's had a traumatic experience. She was physically abused as a child. Her father was a despot and always dreamed about his son who would continue his bloodline. His son died, and instead of the son, he had a daughter. He treated his daughter as an unwanted and beat her without any reason. He did not allow her to wear shoes and ordered her to walk barefoot through the forest. When she got splinters in her foot, he did not allow her to stop and remove them. The grown woman does not have the ability to verbally process her traumatic experiences because all of her experiences were kinesthetic. All of her life she had pain and discomfort. She did not know any pleasure or satisfaction. She can translate her experience from kinesthetic to oral and visual. Her oral experience is crying and yelling. She looks in the mirror for the visual experience, and to express her bitterness, she makes faces. Her life was all about pain and suffering, and she did not grow up to be mature and flexible, but became opinionated and stubborn. Her fragments are loosely associated. Gambling is her intuitive way to get positive emotions. To deal with the pain and suffering, she needs a positive incident. The new kinesthetic experience pleasantly moves her. Unfortunately, she gets addicted and continues gambling despite the losses. Nevertheless, if she debriefs her trauma after the emotional, painful experience, she can avoid the fixation of her fragments. Another woman in her 40s sometimes wins or loses, but does not cross the line of normalcy. She likes to come into the casino because she does not have anything in life of which to be proud. Her lover left her many years ago and she is raising 2 boys on her own. She does not trust anyone, and for her gambling is a substitute for sexual interaction. She continues suffering from her trauma. When she was 17 years old, she fell in love with a married man who was 12 years her senior. The love was very strong and the man wanted to marry her. He went to her parents and told them that he was leaving his wife and his child to marry their daughter. Despite cautions from her parents, the 17-year-old trusted her lover and they became intimate. Very soon she got pregnant, left her parents' home, and lived with her lover. Her lover was a gentleman with soft manners and always nicely explained that he had problems with the divorce. One time he said that he hated the obscure paperwork. The next time he said he had stupid lawyers and that his wife's excessive demands needed mediation. He was financially secure and stable in his work, but he also needed to travel a lot. He always called her from his business trips. Shortly after delivering the first boy, the woman got pregnant again and had a second son. She enjoyed her motherhood until a mutual friend told her terrible news. Her lover had been seeing another woman in the city when he was on business trips. The woman questioned her lover and he denied everything, but the facts came out. The reality was that he had never filed for divorce papers, and as a matter of fact, he did not stop living with his wife. He was a pathological cheater and he lied to both women. The woman clearly understood that she was always a mistress and that her lover would never leave his wife. She immediately left her lover and came back to live with her parents, who took her in with her 2 sons. The woman now does not trust any man. Her emotions are tightly locked away and she does not express them. Gambling gives her a chance to express her emotions. She was deceived by a man whom she loved and completely trusted. Years after her trauma, she started to believe that she was too naive and probably deserved her fate. She got involved with the married man and she did not listen to the voice of common sense coming from her parents. Eventually, she believed that she was not smart enough to deal with any man and saw them as dangerous liars. In the casino, she gambles and loses money. She still continues losing because she does not believe that she deserves to win. Our flexible fragments are getting replaced by fixated ones. As soon as we get into the casino, the fixated fragments replace the flexible ones and provide us with fixated responses. With fixated processor, we continue gambling despite the heavy losses, and we make decisions that are reckless and repulsive. We lose our own money and money borrowed from others. As addicted gamblers, we do not have the strength to stop the process of gambling until we lose absolutely everything. We suppress our feelings of being in danger and do not listen to any of the precautions against unnecessary risk. The gambling rush takes us over, and we place bets on unreasonable odds. After losing a bet, we do not have any money left but we continue with someone else's money and then lose it all over again. It is amazing that when we are not in a situation related to gambling, we are very reasonable with money and might even appear stingy. During gambling, however, we lose our common sense and fail to remember the promises we gave before the game. In times of gambling, our common sense is absent, and we operate on dissimilar parameters than when we give our promises. We split from our wisdom and become irrational. Our life is distorted, but we do not disassociate. In fragmentation, we do not have any feelings of lost time, and our life data is not missing from our memory. We split into many fragments, but do not have diverse personalities. As a result of the split, we disregard everything that we said previously. We forget our criticism of the gambling that we expressed outside of the casino. When we criticize gambling, we have a change in our perspective. It is the result of the transference of our fixated fragments to a flexible one. The noticeable changes which arrive from new configurations of our fragments can be observed by the changes in our energy level, expressions, and appearance. Our new flexible fragments change the interpretations of the stimulation, and we use the new references and are not affected by old stimuli the same way as before. In the past, when we entered a casino, the new chemicals were not included in the processing of information, and we were limited in the interpretation of the memory data. With flexible fragments, everything has changed. In the new regime, the flexibility replaces the previous rigidity. Now, when we enter the casino, our processor retains all memories and data. Our interpretation of the incoming data changes because the neurotransmitters work in the new regime. The firing of neurons is comparable to a fireworks salute during holiday festivals. We do not believe anymore in being reckless because the new interpretation of the data pushes us to be more cautious. The new responses, which utilize the excessive release of neurotransmitters, create restraint for gambling activities. Recreational gamblers. Recreational gamblers with a solid organization of the psyche are not the same as influenced gamblers that have a slack organization. We know that the addictive gamblers have an obsessive psyche with the fixated fragments. We need to separate the obsessive, influenced, and recreational gaming activities. Simply put, gambling is a process of making a bet. We are infatuated with a bet and also need to acknowledge that not every person who is gambling is captivated by passion. It is important to distinguish an addicted gambler from a recreational one who just loves the game or who is influenced by others. Many of us are gamblers, but we are not addicted gamblers. Even when we make bets and play numerous games, we are not addicted. As recreational gamblers, we have a solid psyche. We love the game and appreciate the challenges. We are not doing anything destructive to continue gambling because we can stop at any point and do not have any uncontrollable urges. We do not gamble to the point that we lose everything. We would not give into a recklessness, and we have the ability to use a variety of responses. We do not give in to the urge to place a bet every time. We may not be a compulsive gambler, but because of influences, we can act like one. As influenced gamblers, we have a wobbly organization of our fragments and are very susceptible to the pressure of making a bet. We copy the behavior and attitude of the addicted. The pressure on us as influential gamblers is from the messages of recreational and addicted gamblers that gambling is somehow beneficial. The influence is like a virus that is transmitted to us. As influenced gamblers, we are victims of pomposity, pretension, and grandiosity. Our psychological structure is predisposed to be dominated. While we are in close proximity to the generator of the influence, we show a sign of the addiction. As soon as we are outside of the danger zone, our gambling urges stop. We are not addicted, but under a terrible pressure from an addicted gambler. We do not control our obsession as soon as the galvanizer is around. By being influenced, we can display a variety of addictions that are distinctive from gambling, such as alcohol and drug addiction. As influenced addicts, we involuntarily act as addicted, and we always appear to be under pressure. We stop acting on an obsession as soon as we change our surroundings and our addiction stops. At the influence from a person, we change our psyche's organization. It is a symptom of our fragmented identity. Our lack of solidity and incongruence in our responses is an indicator of the submissiveness of our psyche to external influences. It is also an indicator that our psyche does not have the ability to resist influence. We are not motivated to unify and split. Our conformity leads to submission to external structures. Our structure is a copy, but appears very natural, and the external control is not durable and falls apart when the influence stops. Because we are taken over by a dangerous structure, we endure a lot of damage. By reason of the looming interaction between fragments, we are not aware of our situation and put the self under another structure that is assumingly stronger. As traumatized victims, we also have a wobbly organization of our psyche. Because our turbulent life, we need the safety. Our new structural order is based on the subconscious copy of someone powerful, and reorganization is crucial for our survival. Because of the uncured trauma, we alter our psyche by incorporating reckless behavior. Our fragments rebel against our own domineering fragments, which are not providing our needed security. The pressure of gambling, as well as other influences, happens when all of our structures are shaken, and as a result, our fragments are tentatively linked, and our whole system wants a new structure. The influence for our reconstruction can be from peer pressure, respect, hate, and emptiness, side effects of medication, criminal lifestyle, or pretension. Often the influence happens when we have our incongruent response system. We can hate the uncommon structures but consider them safer than ours. Unconsciously, we pick up the structure that we hate, and as a result become influential gamblers. We are influenced without any persuasion, and our fragments have a loose organization and want to change the domineering rule. When our psyche voluntarily agrees to be influenced by other structures, then the influence is strong and stays for a long time. Nevertheless, as influenced gamblers, we are not the addicted. It is very complicated to distinguish us from addicts, but we are on opposite poles from addicted gamblers. Usually, we are the main benefactors of rehabilitation programs and respond to any help for resisting the influence. Another example of infatuation is sexual addiction, which easily illustrates fragmentation. In our fragmented psyche, one of our fragments is a loving and caring husband and father, and another fragment is a reckless adventurist who can put at stake his family and his family's well-being for the moment of sexual gratification. The conflicting fragments provide us with special responses. Our fragment of the loving husband criticizes his womanizing behavior, but our fragment of the sexual addict defends it. The process of fragmentation shows how the opposite responses emerge and cause our internal conflicts. Our fragments of the caring husband accuses the sexual addict of shaking the long-standing stability of his family for a short moment of sexual gratification. On the other hand, the sexual addict talks about the joy of having this moment of fulfillment because life is very short. Our points of view and justifications change according to various conditions. The circumstance of acting out varies from one situation to another. It is the common tune in the responses of sexual addicts who try to convince us that their behavior is normal. When the fragment of the sexual addict takes over, it looks for unification with various other fragments. We have intense sexually arousing fantasies and even sexual urges towards generally non-sexual stimulations, justifying any perversion. As fetishists, we argue that our responses are normal. An addict who has sexual urges looks for approval and unification with the whole psyche. Our addiction is a dysfunctional way to unify our psyche. Prostitutes are always careful because they are very well aware that we, as their clients, probably are sexual perverts and can have an intent to inflict pain. We do have fragments built on unusual combinations of our brain chemistry, and as a result, we give in to pomposity, pretension, and grandiosity. Our brain's chemistry is not balanced, and our impulsivity and overreaction, as with many other deficiencies, are a result of imbalance in our brain chemistry. The atypical responses result from the work of neurotransmitters that process information in a pervasive regime. Sexual and other hormonal chemicals are released in distinctive areas of our body. The problem is that our fragments affected by perversion view the pervasive data as neutral. Because of traumatic experiences or genetic damage, we do not have the flexibility in our responses. We cannot detect perversion in stimuli and provide responses in dissimilar propensity. Our fixated fragments also provide pervasive responses to ordinary stimulation. When our perversion occurs, we justify our pervasive behavior. Our fragment of the addict splits from the previously domineering neutral fragment, and as a leader, takes over our psyche and accepts our pervasive responses. When the sexual triggers are absent, we suspend the fragments of the addict and troublemaker and we act with restraint. During sexual stimulations, our addict fragment becomes domineering. Our pervasiveness takes over only for a limited amount of time, and our pervasive responses may perhaps be very short. The fragment of the caring husband splits from the fragment of the sexual addict. As soon as stimulation is not present, our neutral fragments replace the fragments affected by perversion. The prostitutes know that. For their services, they take the money up front. The customers lose appreciation for the received services as soon as they achieve sexual gratification, and they will not want to pay. When the stimulation is not active, our fragment of the sex addict unifies with other domineering fragments. When stimulations are not active, we act in front of the prostitutes as very respectful gentlemen who also like to moralize about the wickedness of others, and we believe that we would not pay for sex. Our sexual addiction is probably the result of an influence such as peer pressure. The pressure can be a substance-induced. It may quickly stop when our surroundings change and the substance is not present. The sexual addict is not someone who suffers from obscurity in his relationships, causing a change in partners. Only when we have an impulsive infatuation with sex are we sex addicts. We pursue sexual gratification, exhibiting our impulsiveness and a reckless behavior by interpreting even non-sexual stimulation in a sexual way. The signs of our sexual addiction are the signs of our fixated fragmentation. To resist pervasiveness, we must restructure our psyche. By increasing our plasticity, we reduce the effect of our fixated fragments. When our brain releases chemicals congruent to the stimulation, then we achieve cohesiveness in our responses. We compare our fixated response to our flexible ones. We do compare our fixated and flexible responses. Although they originate from stimulations that are miles apart, we still can be consciously aware of them. We do not have an ability to compare kinesthetic responses to oral and visual ones. When we have flexible fragments, they help us to restructure our psyche. In our conscious mind, we can learn many things from our flexible responses and keep our psyche solid. The biggest danger to our solidity is that after a trauma, our flexible responses are altered and can become fixated. The structure of our traumatized psyche gets fixated too. To remedy this, we identify the fragments affected by fixation. After identifying fixated fragments, we can restructure them back to flexibility. We look for the flexible responses even on unusual ways of expression. Flexible fragments help us to deal with the fixation. We use a powerful lexicon that has the strong, forward-moving words. The forceful expressions sound like do, go, take, and move. When we get stressed and get into altercations, and our domineering fragments produce many kinesthetic responses. With domineering oral fragments, we offer a world of sounds and use of words like please, listen, and good. When our domineering fragments are based on visual responses, we use words that are dissimilar. As adults, we also have children's responses. We express the self as children in our distinctive modes of expression. The children have more visual responses and respond better to visual stimulation. They ask questions like, what kind of color? Who is the blonde? Is the moon really so big? And more. After psychological trauma, our body gets tense and prepares for other attacks, and our kinesthetic responses may become limited and rigid. We consider the environment to be unsafe and restrain the self. Our responses become altered and fixated. We use expressions like, leave me alone, go away, stop bothering me, and more. The change can happen even after a very low stress level. We experience adverse reactions towards the light and bright colors. We hate some forms and objects without any reason. Everything that we see is ugly, too dark, nasty, messy, or worse. With olfactory-based fragments, we might say, is something fishy here? It smells so bad. What if the smell stays forever? With tactile fragments, we would say, don't tickle me, don't touch me, do not come close to me. If you touch me, I will vomit. After trauma, adults get tense and frozen, but children often fidget and shake. Our brain is better at responding to already learned stimuli triggered by familiar brain chemicals. To restructure our psyche, we analyze our oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory responses to find the dominant responses. We discover that the responses in a particular area of our brain have been altered. In our analysis, we pinpoint the event when our responses changed. We translate our flexible responses to our diverse styles of expression, where we have fixated responses. To restructure our psyche, we compare the flexible responses to the fixated responses on our traumatic life experiences. Fixated fragments are the result of psychological struggles. Our fixated fragments formed as a result of our lack of conscious clarity about psychological struggle. When our brain has an impediment in adequately processing information, we rely on a fixated combination of chemicals. The release of brain chemicals is not congruent with corresponding oral, visual, and kinesthetic stimulations. Our responses are confusion, fear, and agitation, and we make assumptions without any evidence and even against the facts. Without any evidence, we feel that the stressful event will reoccur, and we activate the fixated responses. Our brain processes new information in the previously used part of the brain. We are responding in the old way to the new information. The fixated fragments are a result of the physiological impairments in our brain. We trigger the faulty learning, which is the result of our inability to decode, transport, and process specific information, and we cannot distinguish dangerous signals from ordinary ones. This is the cause of our psychological and physiological impairment. We process all incoming stimulations in the same way as we have before with the same brain chemicals. Our failure to handle the information on an individual basis supports our confusion. Our psyche is confused and provides us with atypical and bizarre responses. We are shocked and frightened and scared in the same way as viewers of horror movies. In scary movies, we hear a very intense sound, but we do not receive any confirming visual information. We see the killer's foot, but we do not see his face. We suspect that everyone in the movie is a killer. The scary scenes accompanied by the sounds, such as the telephone ringing, prowling steps, and a tea kettle whistling, are loosely related to the plot of the movie. The incongruities create uncertainty and fears, and the intense repetitive sound prepares us for an alarming situation. We experience the frightened feelings because we are confused. In movies, when we do not have enough visual information to process, we jump to conclusions by using our imagination about how the crime would be committed. Meanwhile, we are frightened as if we see that a cat or dog was also killed. The human is still alive and the mystification continues. Director does not need to do much to scare us because we are already baffled by incomplete information. To stimulate our imagination, the director forces us to process oral stimulation without the visual stimulation. When the information lacks clarity and is mystifying, the responses are our feelings of terror, nervousness, rage, and emotional volatility. The incomplete information also triggers the desire to run away and to close our eyes because we do not wish to face the unknown. We have a hurdle to process the information, and because of our confusion, we receive the bewildering stimulations and get very scared. In the same way, if we struggle with our coordination, we are scared of dancing. If we suffer from dyslexia, we are scared of spelling. The restructuring of our psyche allows us to change our perception about the psychological struggle. It gives us the unique approach to process information, reduce confusion, and reinstall confidence in our ability to handle out information. In restructuring the fixated fragments, we clear up confusion, reduce fearfulness, and bring traumatic events to conscious awareness. By debriefing, we bring our traumatic event to our consciousness. After regaining our conscious awareness, as the next step, we create plasticity in the release of the brain's chemicals. By translating our information to specific modes of expression, we avoid fixation, increasing the plasticity of our fragments, and restore a congruent response to other events. The psyche produces expressions unrelated to the stimulations. When our psyche splits from plasticity to fixation, we produce expressions that are unrelated to the stimulations. Our emotional instability is visible when we display our emotions in an inappropriate manner. Our emotional frigidity takes place when we display emotional unresponsiveness and numbness. When we express anger, agitation, aggravation, and irritability without any provocation, then the inappropriate arousing is associated with a lack of comprehension and attention, and also with the presence of atypical distortions. The roots of our emotional dysfunctions are in the faulty organization of our psyche. We have an incongruent response in the same stimulations. Some of our fragments dramatize our responses, and others do not act enough to even produce a valid response. They're in the constant confrontation when one fragment overreacts and another does not react enough. Our psyche never feels content, and the other fragments can sabotage our relationship. Our feuding fragments push us to be aggressive, and perhaps we squeeze our girlfriend's breast in an elevator. She feels offended and scolds us. We also fail to have appropriate attire on a special date, and we forget to bring flowers. Our significant other gets upset again, and we feel upset too. We are not satisfied with the self because we did not have the ability to express our emotions in an appropriate way. We are in love, but we do not show our feelings. We feel distress when our emotional expressions do not produce the desired result. When we receive a negative reaction from our significant other, we feel unsatisfied and lost. Our emotional dysfunction is created by our inability to provide emotions that are harmonious with stimulation. When we do not feel emotions, we cannot produce appropriate responses. The split is shown in the fixated fragmentation when our psyche produces only overreaction or inadequate reaction. Our psyche is not able to tune to the stimuli and produce an appropriate reaction. Our incongruent and repetitive actions are a sign of splitting. When we are always late, it is a sign that we suffer from a split and a presence of a fixated fragment in our psyche. We ignore stimulations and always respond in the same manner. We are late for many occasions and feel bad, but we do not have the strength to change anything. Because emotions are on a subconscious level, we are not able to change our fixated fragments. We also do not know how to manage our emotions, denying that we have the troublemaker fragments in our psyche. The troublemaker fragments seduce us to be late for appointments and then torture us for being late. They constantly release unpleasant feelings and suppress our joy for life. We need to restructure our dysfunctional psyche. We must bring to our consciousness our dysfunctional emotional structure and provide a verbal correction. When our fragments are united, we understand that our lateness is not related to our whole psyche, but is caused only by our troublemaker fragments. By having a meeting and dialogue with our fragments, we can identify the troublemakers and deal with them. On a conscious level, together with other fragments, we are able to supervise them and achieve internal tranquility by creating the dialogue between dissimilar fragments, allowing them to inject plasticity into our emotions. As a result of the correction, we arrive on time to our meetings and do not need to continue with our usual misery. The shortness of harmonious interactions. The shortness of the harmonious interaction between verbalization and our expressed emotion is a sign of the presence of the fixated fragments in our psyche. We are stocked with emotions and perhaps do not have the ability to get them out. This inability is not related to a deficiency in our education. It is a physiological impairment. Our incongruence between verbalizing and expressing our emotions contributes to our lack of sophistication in our verbal and emotional intellects. Our brain does not recognize, and it is not adequately translating the stimulations. Our spoken deficiency is associated with the trouble to produce verbal response. It is imperative for the verbal intellect to have an ability to focus on the topic and to avoid circumstantialities. When we have impenetrability in verbal communication, we can process our emotions in distinct approaches. The expressions of anger, agitation, aggravation, and despair are best expressed in kinesthetic form. Our kinesthetic expressions get exaggerated because of a perceived lack of understanding. Expression of emotions in exaggerated kinesthetic form indicate the presence of fixated fragments and a lack of verbal capacity. If we suffer from intermediate explosive disorder, then we display exaggerated forms of our aggressiveness and express completely incongruent emotions during episodes. The reactions are grossly out of proportion and do not match any pre-existing stressors. By our movements, we express our most offensive emotions, which have a goal to scare, intimidate, and push others into submission. We express our explosiveness in kinesthetic forms, including assault and destruction of property. As patients in a mental hospital, we often display explosiveness. When we are talking to another patient and the nurse interrupts our conversation, we get an explosive reaction. We are upset that the nurse interrupted our conversation by asking us to take our medication, and as a result, we want to hurt the nurse. Our reaction is not congruent with the stimulation. The nurse's actions were not asking for a violent reaction. It is important for us as the patient in the hospital to take medication at a particular time. That is the reason that the nurses are very direct when they administer medication. The straightforwardness of the nurse upsets us, but it is not a reason to hurt her. When our verbal intellect is suppressed and we do not provide an exit for the emotions, our psyche uses kinesthetic expression to substitute for the verbal. Our exaggerated expressions of rage are often kinesthetic, and we are always ready to express them. Our expressions of being annoyed, irritability, and anxiety are involuntary. When they are incongruent to stimulation, they create a lot of disturbances. Our emotional astuteness can be presented by our capacity to experience bottomless feelings of love, compassion, and trust, and also by our ability to express them verbally. If the fragments have plasticity, our emotions can express harmoniously and in a variety of forms. Our harmonious expressions are congruent with stimulations. Usually we use kinesthetic expressions when an immediate response is required. Because verbal expressions require a longer time to prepare, we express emotions right away by using our movements and our posture. Our vocal aptitude is linked to the richness and deepness of our emotional articulation, and our verbal intellect is associated with the ability to understand and separate the importance from insignificance. By using meetings and dialogues between fragments, we restore our harmonious interaction between verbalization and emotion. The congruence between our verbal and kinesthetic expressions restores our emotional balance and helps us achieve emotional stability. In our reactions with others, we harmoniously express our emotions appropriately. Because of various physiological complicatedness and language barriers and inadequate education, we do not have the ability to express the self. An indication of the fixation of the psyche is the hurdle to verbalize our emotions and the struggles to match incoming signals with emotions. The restructuring of our psyche. If we want to restructure our psyche, we bring our traumatic experiences to conscious awareness. By verbalizing a traumatic event, we experience our emotionally shocking encounter in a safe environment. Eventually, after several repetitions, we can achieve equilibrium between our verbal and emotional expressions. The restructuring is a regulatory process that is available in our conscious mind and allows us to regain control over our expressed emotions. When we verbalize our traumatic experiences, we transport our emotions from the subconscious to the conscious mind. In many instances, our conscious mind does not accept the gravity of our trauma and pushes it back to the subconscious. We receive involuntarily replays of the traumatic event because our subconscious mind sends visual and oral reruns. When we have our flashbacks, we see and hear distinctive voices or even noises related to the trauma. We re-experience distress and our trauma reoccurs. By comparing our feelings and the diverse manners of expression, we understand our strengths and weaknesses and estimate our capacity for handling the pain and the deepness of our emotions associated with the ordeal. We use comparable forms of expression and achieve congruency while processing the damages. We reduce our overreaction by opening a dialogue within several ways of expression. Our sensations have kinesthetic, oral, and visual forms, and our function is to understand our feelings on different sensors, translate our sensations to the verbal expression, and then compare our reactions. We can perhaps correlate them to discovering the existence of our overreaction. We correct our overreaction by using self-awareness and self-regulation. They stabilize our increased heart palpitations and regulate the shortage of breath. Because the fragments are part of our psyche, we consciously are aware of dissimilar chemistries between our fragments. Our feelings and reactions are affected by splitting. When we deal with our pain and suffering, we have dialogues with our fragments, and we become united when we have meetings. To be prepared for our internal meeting, we consciously identify our fragments and engage them in dialogue. Within the self, we can accomplish our unification. This is a way to tune up the parts of our psyche and to remedy our traumas and splits. Our internal communication becomes a balanced system, and our psyche can be whole. Unlike internal dialogue, external dialogue cannot happen very often because we rely only on our intuition to validate the intentions of others. Dialogue with others has an impediment because we cannot know for sure the feelings of others. Even when we are close to them, we do not know much about their fragments. They have many chemical reactions that we have not experienced. When we are communicating with the fragments of others, we may not be experiencing dialogue and meeting. Nevertheless, we can enroll in successful negotiations to avoid misunderstandings and more damage to our relationship. Through negotiations, we can successfully communicate with others, and our styles of expressions can be verbal, kinesthetic, and visual. When we are completely open to others, we can have intuitive forms of dialogue with them. External dialogue mainly depends on our intuition because it is too complicated for us to completely understand others. The dialogue is an exchange of our feelings. We form a dialogue when we understand others. Being aware of the sensation of others is a form of dialogue. Sex is also an external dialogue. We achieve unity by giving each other pleasure. In sex, we have a moment of external meeting which occurs in an intuitive level. Unlike our external dialogues, our internal dialogues require a conscious awareness of our inner feelings. The kinesthetic expression is domineering. When we experience anger and frustration, our kinesthetic reactions take over all of our functions. We express the self on the body's automatic level of functioning, which includes increased heart palpitations, muscle tension, and rapid breathing. In this highly intense situation, our verbal and auditory responses become very limited. The splitting occurs when the flexible releases of our brain chemicals are replaced by fixated combinations. When our trauma is strong, we are in the state of anger and frustration, and our psyche works on autopilot. All manner of communications, which include our complicated movements and spoken and oral expressions, get shut down to a very simple level. We use simple movements, have inconvenience using our verbal expressions, and have trouble understanding oral information and react only to simple oral signals. We are in a state of being shut down from our sophisticated communications and are descending to our basic level of expression, which does not include our verbalization of feelings. We switch to altered levels of expressions. It is like changing speeds by switching gears in an automobile, and the car's speed decreases. At low speed, the car cannot cover the same distance compared to running on a high gear. At the low level, our psyche does not accommodate our high-functioning verbal fragments, and we rely more on our kinesthetic fragments. In our affective state of mind, all our capacities of communication are shut down, and we are left with the choice of flight or fight, and simple oral sounds are our only available resources. Our physical pain is a kinesthetic feeling that comes from our body. The response to pain triggers specific ways of expression. When pain is at a significant level, the psyche focuses only on the area where the pain is generated. When we win a lottery but are in pain, we do not care much about money. When we are hurt, our natural responses mostly depend on the intensity of our pain, and we yell and cry. By knowledge from our birth, we make sounds with apprehension. When we match the intensity of the produced sound with our pain, we let others understand our suffering. When we are in pain, we are on the most basic level of our functioning. We have obstacles to identify our pain by our verbal expressions because the verbalization requires a distinct level of functioning. Our talks about pain do not help. The verbalization requires time and takes our attention away from our pain. The verbalization of the pain in many instances is not a distraction from pain, but quite the opposite. It expands our pain. We distract ourselves from the pain by listening to someone's pleasant voice or by being with a loved one. When we visualize a variety of colors and match them with pain intensity, we also have some decrease in pain. Our psyche has diverse levels of functioning, and on every level, it activates diverse fragments with dissimilar responses. We restructure our brain to have congruent responses, apprising and matching our feelings. We rely on oral, visual, and kinesthetic forms of expression to respond adequately to new situations, and verbalization helps us to restructure our fragments according to the new situation to find an appropriate way of expressing our feelings. However, identifying the divergent expressions is not the end of the task. We also need to match stimulations with our capacity of anger management and impulse control. We identify the other options, and fighting can be avoided if we generate suggestions as to how to negotiate and look for more peaceful solutions. We rely on these various approaches, which are distinctive from kinesthetic forms. If we have a solid identity and become angry and frustrated, our verbal and oral forms of communications are adequate and match the kinesthetic. We do not rely on the kinesthetic styles of expression. We control our reactivity and tune our emotions to the intensity of incoming oral, visual, and kinesthetic information. We create equilibrium in the processing of information and do not overreact. The stimulation that seemed not tolerable for others is controllable for us. Olfactory stimulations seem unendurable. When we express unpleasant odors, we react kinesthetically because it triggers in us a reaction of jumpiness and anger. Our anger subdues when we observe that others feel the same uneasiness in the odor endures. The verbalization of our discomfort and validation from others makes the discomfort more tolerable. The kinesthetic functions stop domineering our responses, and we allow the verbalization of our oral and visual sensations, which may trigger a humorous exchange of jokes. We see the completely changed responses and notice expressions that change from anger and frustration. The psychotic process is characterized by incongruent responses. The psychotic mind can be described by the incongruence and the loose connection between the psyche. Our communications are incongruent with others who saw the same thing, and our reactions on the same precipitated factor can be far apart. We reply differently to the same stressors, sometimes with accelerated movement and a loud voice, and sometimes we have nightmares and flashbacks. Our psychotic symptoms include hallucinations, which are the manifestations of the split. Our imaginative forces create the split, and these processes are not yet simple. To solidify our psyche together with restructuring, we may require pharmacological intervention. Our distortions and psychoses are symptoms of splitting and are a demonstration of the disproportionately elevated incongruence of our internal processes. The precipitating factor can be completely imaginative and may be psychotic by nature. It can also relate to a real and stressful situation. In our psyche organization, the oral and visual hallucinations and delusion take over all aspects of our life and present us as psychotics. By understanding the psychotic processes, we can learn a lot about the function of our mind. Our symptoms and atypical distortions are a mark of incongruent organization. We have psyches that include the stressed and depressed fragments. We experience the flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, nightmares, and we have exaggerated kinesthetic functions. Our symptoms include the inability to control the repetitive, accelerated movements, restlessness, fidgeting, fears, panic attacks, and rapid speech. We react on insignificant details, detaching and daydreaming. The stimulations that trigger our exaggeration are visual, oral, kinesthetic, and olfactory, and they commonly trigger incompatible reactions. Our incongruent responses are indications of fixated fragments, which can display hallucinations or hyperactivity and are distinct from flexible responses that match stimulations. After balancing and restructuring our fixated fragments into flexible ones, we realize that some of our reactions are exaggerated. By translating our responses into a discrete manner, we lower the intensity and exaggeration. Our flexible fragments do not support any kind of fixation and include the hyperactivity and hallucinations. We use the same reality testing used everywhere for reducing psychosis. Via congruent responses, we send the message to our brain through various types of communication that the hallucinations, flashbacks, and nightmares are not real. They are about the dangerous past and have nothing to do with our safe present. By restructuring our psyche, we adjust our kinesthetic responses to our congruent reactions. The vigor of our reaction decreases when the oral, visual, and olfactory information does not support the intensity. In restructuring, we balance the exaggerated information from our oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory areas of our brain. The process of decreasing incongruence is also very helpful in the reduction of our psychotic responses. The route of creating congruent responses is in the process of balancing our exaggerated reactions. The process of decreasing incongruence is universal and helps us reduce our psychotic responses. The result of splitting is overreacting and a loss of tolerance. Anyone can split, but as the victims of numerous psychological traumas, we suffer from constant splitting. We lose tolerance and overreact about any threatening stimulation. If we are victims of robbery, we overreact to visual stimulation and become fixated on adverse stimulations during the robbery. After being pressured to give up our jewelry and money at gunpoint, we overreact. We also get very sensitive to kinesthetic stimulation because the assailant's posture was very frightening. If we were in an auto accident, we become very sensitive to aural stimulations, the noises from car motors and brakes. We also have an excessive reaction when we see racing or clashing cars. We have a number of fixated fragments that generate fear and despair. Any of the fixations can cause a split in our psyche. Our split has many warnings, including tension, fearfulness, and anxiety. In our psyche, we can identify numbers of our fixated and flexible fragments. We understand that our problem started with the fixated fragments becoming a domineering force. To have stable responses, we use our strengths instead of weaknesses and reorganize our psyche. We restructure our fixated fragments to have flexible responses. If our psyche still has plasticity, we use an appropriate response and use various means to respond to the stimulations. With the presence of plasticity, we can control our overreaction and decrease fixations. We mobilize our flexible fragments by switching the internal force from splitting to unification, and we form an atmosphere of tolerance and respect. The process on our conscious level, and to avoid overreaction, we balance our responses in a discrete manner of expression. The process of unification generates great feelings of self-satisfaction, respect, content, and healthy self-esteem. If our kinesthetic responses are more stable and do not produce exaggerated reactions, then our visual oral information gets tuned into a kinesthetic response. Our aversive olfactory stimulations do not create agitation if they are not supported by other forms of expressions. As workers on a farm, we are exposed to intense smells. We are informed that intense smell does not do any harm and is one of the routine demands of our job, so it needs to be tolerated. We know that chickens are harmless, and the visual and oral information does not support any danger from the odor. As a result, we are not disturbed by the stink and do not wear cotton masks, nor do we experience any threatening emotions because domestic fowl are very peaceful birds. We do not sense any discomfort. In places where we are not informed about the harmlessness of smell and we are not trained to tolerate intense olfactory stimulations, the odor creates an uncommon response. We get angry when we detect even slight odor in the sauna. When we are in the sauna to relax and do not expect any disturbances, as workers of the chicken farm, we are more tolerant to smells because our mental process forms a flexible response. To investigate any of our discomfort, we check our vital signs. If vital signs do not support our worries, we better tolerate our discomforts. If we have plasticity in responses to olfactory stimulation, we are more tolerant to other stimuli. As chicken farm workers, we have tolerant responses also to verbal and visual stimulations. We do not make a big deal of unusual verbal comments because we are already trained to control our reactions. Our behavior is congruent with the tolerant responses to the intense olfactory stimulations. Conversely, when we did not have tolerance training and are called a mama's boy, we get angry and get insulted because we did not learn any restraint of our emotions and want to start a confrontation right away. Instead of laughing, we are fighting. To ignore provoking stimulations, we do not need to be trained at a chicken farm. We may achieve the same result by relying on our flexible styles of expression. Before responding, we should assess how our various types of expressions relate to the stimulation. We empower the flexible fragments which do not support overreaction. We do not hold on to anger and anxiety, and as a result, we avoid splitting and fixation. After the trauma, if we are able to restructure our psyche for flexibility, then instead of the misery of overreaction, we enjoy unification and tolerance. We avoid unneeded and incomplete responses. In order to have balanced responses, we avoid unneeded and incomplete replies. Usually, our unbalanced responses can be categorical, demanding, passive, and automatic. They already set us to explode easily, to be very limited and deviant, and not to have any analytical capacity. We appear to be inflexible and tough while producing dictatorial commands. We are frequently too quick with replies. The first responses of our psyche represent our fears, angers, and worries. They are usually accompanied by physical reactions such as increased heart rate, shortness of breath, and chest heaviness. Often, our incongruence happens when our stimulations are atypical for us in the manners of expression. Our visual and oral stimulations request the kinesthetic responses and vice versa. The incongruence between the types of stimulation and the response creates an overreaction. We become worried and fearful when our child is unexpectedly late from school. All these problems occur because our oral, visual, and kinesthetic experiences are not congruent and do not produce the needed information. We can visualize that our child strayed in school for an extracurricular activity, and for oral forms, we recall a sports event in which our child participates. Then our worries and fears decrease. In order to have flexible responses and to avoid overreaction, even if it takes time, it is important to check stimulations from all possible angles and translate them to discrete methods of expression. We were traumatized when we were placed in an elevator that fell from the 10th floor, and we miraculously survived due to the shaft's emergency brake. During this fall, we thought that we would definitely die, and we experienced a shock. The only recollection we had was a kinesthetic reaction of grabbing something to hold on to. We have flashbacks about to fall and the screeching noise of the elevator brakes. We are really distorted, sustained some physical injuries, and experienced a strong psychological trauma. We need serious mental work to deal with this trauma. We visualize the brakes that slowed down the elevator and saved us in order to regain control of our life and get over the shock of this experience. We recall the noise we did hear during the fall and realize that it was the noise from the brakes that saved us. Our kinesthetic response was adjusted by oral and visual experiences. Our heart palpitations decreased and our respiratory function returned to normal. In times of worry, instead of thinking about horrible things, we have an ability to visualize something pleasurable. If we are alone waiting for a bus in a dangerous area and the bus is running late or may not arrive at all, we are aware of danger and pace feeling worried and unsafe. Conversely, if we visualize a relaxing walk, think about the nice scenery, and take the opportunity to have a relaxing exercise and even listen to soothing music, then fears and worries decrease. Even if one of our responses is very deep, but the others around us are not validating that intensity, then the worries and fears are significantly reduced. We experience a change in our physical responses, such as deepening our respiration and regulating our heartbeat. By using plasticity, we can enhance the process of unification and balance our responses. The flexible fragments provide us with an array of balanced responses to various stimulations. The formation of the best one takes time, and we produce the response that exactly matches that stimulation. Overdevelopment in the kinesthetic area. The overdevelopment of our kinesthetic area leads to our confusion in an understanding that oral and visual stimulations, and as a result, causes inconvenience in negotiations with others. Our psyche, with domineering kinesthetic fragments and splits from our other modalities, excludes them from processing information. When we cannot properly translate our visual and oral responses to kinesthetic form, our negotiations with others are only on the kinesthetic level. The exclusions of other forms bring our negotiations to a more primitive level and usually result in a split. The overdevelopment in our kinesthetic area leads to feelings of grandiosity and superiority. It accounts for our more primitive view of the world. Our disturbance in attention and concentration is related to kinesthetic overdevelopment. Our brain chemicals are distributed only in limited areas of our brain and cause them to overwork, so we lose our ability to process stimulations. We do not use reality probes, which come from our visual and oral sources. When we negotiate from the kinesthetic form and our opponents are on the oral and visual level, we do not understand them. We use the kinesthetic way to solve our grievances. We make some body movements and show our strength to our negotiators. We have an opportunity to show our strength, but we need to do everything in accordance with our honorable agreements and without physically hurting others. As bullies, we are usually underdeveloped in the kinesthetic areas and want to fight, so we challenge our surroundings. Some of our opponents will take our challenge, but a lot of them will not, and they give up. If we are not bullies, we might fight sometimes, but we do not feel like fighting. We do not have many choices and prefer to split from our internal aggressor because we still hope for unification. We are not violent, but we face a predicament on how to avoid fighting and to prevent more splitting. We hope to succeed in negotiations and to avoid confrontation. Behind every split is unhappiness, and we find no benefits in physical confrontation. The fight is a split and includes the use of force. In our negotiations, a dilemma is always present: to fight or not to fight. It really means whether or not to have negotiations. The clash starts when one of the negotiators refuses to bargain. He does not believe that a bad peace is better than a good war. The fighters rarely deal with reality and rely on their kinesthetic abilities. We are targets of bullies and rely on negotiations. The negotiations with bullies are dirty, but we expect fairness, and as usual, we fail in our negotiations. We do not have enough flexibility to prevent the fight, and very soon we split and settle our differences with brute force. In the animal kingdom, the animals negotiate before a fight. They make some sound to caution the opponent of the consequences of the fight, presenting distinct postures to demonstrate that they are determined. When the differences are not resolved by talks, our failures of compromise is the start of the confrontation. Our opponents are too driven by the splitting, and soon the fight starts. Often the others are the initiators of the fight, and we only reluctantly enter the conflict. The fight usually has the goal of harm, and we detach from other feelings. The attackers do not have empathy and show a clear indication of emotional instability. The worst scenario happens when we run away from a fight, and then during the chase, the encounter gets bloody. In many instances, when we ask for help and no one responds, we must survive in any way possible. We can be destroyed when we continue to fight without the proper strength. If during the fight our opponent appears stronger, then we need to surrender or expect to be seriously injured. In the fight, our opponent wants to hurt us, and to survive, we split on all levels of functioning. The winner is the one who hurts his opponent more, but if no one wins, sometimes negotiations can start again. Our solid psyche is more inclined to settle for negotiation. When we have an internal split, we are more driven to fight. As successful negotiators, we achieve congruency in our perceptions by learning new ways of interaction. In negotiation, we send probes to understand the intention of the other psyche. We need to be sure that the opposing psyche is ready for agreement but does not cover the goal of manipulation and confrontation. To negotiate agreement, both psyches should have a sincere desire to work together. If we are pretending to be negotiators but are just taking the time to restructure our forces, then the negotiation fails. If we refuse to negotiate, then we have another fight. Sometimes it appears that we reach an agreement, but this agreement is only on paper and the splitting is unresolved. The peace does not stay for long if we are not satisfied, even if we have a written agreement. If we have the better negotiating position but do not understand the turmoil in the opponent's psyche, we can lose. If we are just enjoying the better terms and are getting pleasure from winning, we can lose. Sometimes our negotiations are a gamble, and it can turn out that our opponent is not yet prepared to cooperate, in which case the split resurfaces and leads to confrontation. When the neurological paths in the kinesthetic area of our brain are impaired, we focus on other areas and emphasize the oral and visual experiences. Contrary to the kinesthetic in our oral and visual processes, we rely on the history of verbal and written agreements. The real negotiators don't go for short-term solutions, but aim for long-term understandings. If we are suffering from emotional instability or attention deficit, we have trouble recognizing and identifying our feelings. Then we need to restructure our psyche. The modification of our psyche to be a better negotiator effectively helps us. Without wasting time on the physiology and pharmacology aspect, we help our brain to achieve a balance. We're not exercising excessive knowledge of the neurological passes through which the brain's chemistry moves. In our psyche, we transfer the kinesthetic responses to the oral and visual areas. To restructure the overdeveloped kinesthetic area, we explore visual and oral feelings about all kinesthetic activities, including tactile experiences. In our psyche, we process our conscious awareness of our oral and visual feelings and how to resolve our grievances without a fight. The constant overstimulation of particular areas of our brain. The overstimulated areas of our brain produce a split, and as a result, our psyche creates fixated fragments. We are overstimulated when our brain disproportionately only uses a few areas. The root of psychological addiction is genetics and chemical imbalance, and it results in the creation of overstimulated and out of balance areas in our brain. When we have too many gratifying stimulations, we get out of touch with reality and do not recognize our dependency. We also carry a lot of misery. We continuously lose at gambling, and others think that we are dejected. We cannot recognize that we are acting foolishly. We do not care about the opinions of others, and against all rules of reality, we never accept that we are losers. We have a stumbling block to a realistic perception of our abilities, and we hold back oral information and use fixated fragments. Our incongruent responses are a result of overenthused areas in our brain. We lack congruency between oral, visual, and kinesthetic responses. In gambling, we rely on luck and make too many bets. We are fascinated with our relationship with fortune. Our responses have patterns of fixation. As gamblers, we are servants of luck and follow all the superstitious rules to keep chance on our side, but our responses become contradictory. When we are away from gambling, we reject gambling as a money-wasting activity, but we do not reject our relationship with luck. We do not see the self as a failure. We believe that luck is on our side, which is common for all gamblers. We consider as fact that for a short time, luck can turn away, but we also believe that eventually fortune is on our side. We reject the opinion that gambling is a sickness and that we are under control of the fixated fragments. And we reject the external reality to follow our internal feelings and eliminate outside criteria. Eventually, we are forced by grave circumstances to have some recognition of reality, and we have a lot of resentments inside of us. We hate to be losers. The overindulged areas of the brain are not synchronized in the processing of information. In our overstimulated area, we produce too many domineering responses. To satisfy those areas, we create fixated responses and become a servant of our overenthused feelings, behaving in the same way that spoiled children do. We get hooked on imaginative gratification and allow powerful, dominant fragments to rule our psyche. We do not care about anything else but our own gratification. We are bothered by thoughts of being underappreciated geniuses. By being actors, singers, artists, and mathematicians, we use the overstimulated areas in our brain. We get our main gratification from winning and are out of touch with reality because for us the most important thing is our games. For a few, the life of others becomes a game. If we have leadership abilities, we can be leaders of revolutions, sects, and terrorist activities. We believe that we are saving the world and listen to our domineering fixated fragments. We spend all of our energy to suppress the messages of being a failure and use the fixated fragments to avoid external reality. The underdevelopment of kinesthetic expressions. We can have underdeveloped kinesthetic abilities, but we do not understand the severity of the problem. Consciously, we are not aware of our struggles, and we do not know how to remedy the problem and are playing games. While gambling, we do not have any inconvenience interacting with others. We feel relaxed because we see the other players as our enemies and our anger covers our impairments. During a football game, we can hurt another player and do not think twice when attacking the other team. When we are not playing games and face real life, however, our behavior may not be similar to our game interactions. We are suffering from underdeveloped kinesthetic abilities. We look tense, and our oral and visual abilities are not congruent with our kinesthetic. When we get upset, we can be very violent. When we are angry, our vocabulary is poor and we use offensive gestures. We are moving in the stereotypic patterns, which is a sign of fixated fragments. We also present timidity and restriction in our movements. We do not feel good about the self, easily become confused, and do not know what to do with our hands, and feel that we are inflexible. We often get upset without any reason, blaming the self for being different. In social situations and in school, we feel inadequate and want to modify our behavior because our responses are incongruent. As youngsters, the biggest part of our communication is through the kinesthetic expressions. Our kinesthetic impairments cause a strong split. Some of us do not realize the difference between games and real life. We are victims because we bring the aggressiveness of the game to the real life. We cover our imperfections in underdeveloped areas, but we cannot fool bullies who somehow know we can be challenged and victimized in the same way as wild animals intuitively recognize who can be prey. Bullies do not care how intelligent and nice we are because they evaluate only our kinesthetic abilities. Intuitively, they know that we are scared and we become victims. They also know that we are demoralized and weak and not careful. We are the victims of bullies because we have the intricacy to interpret and properly respond to our kinesthetic stimulations, and because we do not believe in our own kinesthetic abilities. Our fixated fragments cause a split, and we avoid having congruent kinesthetic reactions. We split from kinesthetic to our visual and oral experiences. The split in our psyche is reflected in our antagonistic feelings towards others. We use the fixated fragments to hide our underdeveloped abilities. The underdevelopment of our kinesthetic expressions causes a split in our psyche and can be mild or severe. When we reject our kinesthetic reactions and rely only on our visual and oral feelings, our wrong processing of kinesthetic stimulation and mistaken interpretation leads to severe disturbances like paranoia and, as a result, sudden and unprovoked outbursts of anger. To balance our mild obstacles, we must reinforce our kinesthetic system and strengthen our existing abilities, challenging our beliefs that we cannot produce the appropriate kinesthetic responses. We consciously understand that while we have major losses of our abilities, we are building a new structure to make our reactions congruent with stimulations. We restructure our fixations and create a plasticity to provide an array of our congruent responses so that we can have a deep understanding of our reactions. We open the new relationships with our underdeveloped kinesthetic fragments and express our feelings about kinesthetic imbrications and responses, having a dialogue with connected fragments. Eventually, we become sure that we are capable of producing the appropriate kinesthetic responses in our relations with others change. Domineering and overstimulated responses. Our underused areas of the brain are straight, always criticizing our gambling behavior, but they are not strong enough to stop the destructive tendencies of overstimulated areas. Our underused fragments do not process information to their full capacity, and in many instances, they can be torturous but lack the power to change our behavior. As gamblers, because of our underused areas, we are ashamed of the self and feel weak and inadequate. When we are losing in gambling, we cover it up and listen only to selective messages. We reject the honest messages, which come from the underdeveloped areas of the brain, and we respond only to affirmative statements about gambling. The suppression of criticizing fragments drains a lot of power from our domineering fragments, and as a result, our domineering fragments overuse their energy base. When our psyche relies on overused fragments, we are always on guard, focusing on prevention of negative views on our weaknesses. We avoid the influence of any bits of reality, and our domineering fragments do not accept messages that are in the underused areas of the brain. Dominant fragments keep us insulated from emotional pain, which can be articulated by underused fragments. We have internal messages like, "Luck will be good to me after midnight," and "I lost because someone next to me brought me bad luck." We are nasty to others who challenge our perception. You live your life the way you want to, but I know that my life is short and I want to have fun. And I do not have any responsibilities for anyone besides myself. I am sick and tired of being considerate of others. It is not anyone's business what I do with my money. We suppress our underused fragments, and they cannot change our behavior. The roots of lasting gambling addiction are in the overstimulated fragments. We have many pleasurable thoughts and desires and expectations about favorable activities. When we feel satisfied, it is similar to gratifying the crying infant who is demanding a toy. We can attribute the process of gambling to relaxation, saying that we use the gambling as an escape from stress. Our addiction to gambling can be triggered by medication, alcohol, drugs, and genetic factors. Our gambling addiction continues despite the opposition of underused fragments, which are splitting and generating negative emotions. The underused fragments are honest, straightforward, and blunt. We totally ignore them. Underused fragments do not waste any energy on diplomacy, but they are not strong. They promise that they will not let us go back to gambling, but the domineering fragments again push the gambler to the table. In the meantime, the underused areas produce feelings of guilt, depression, and inadequacy. Unfortunately, the underused fragments do not affect gambling addiction even after heavy losses. The affirmative messages from the domineering fragments in overstimulated areas replace the messages from underused areas. The reason for our failure to stop affirmation is that instead of giving constructive suggestions, we are criticizing the self. We constantly keep the self in a suffering state without providing an acceptable plan for recovery. We continue our distractive behavior despite our painful losses because we narcoticize our perception with overstimulated fragments which attribute gambling pleasure. Their message implies that to have pleasure, we need to pay. The root of our behavior lies in confusion. We are not dealing properly with our addiction and are mixing our perception and opportunities. When we accept the fact that we are infected with the gambling addiction, we expect an imminent relapse. Our understimulated fragments are weak, and we do not resist any of our excitements and desires. Because our fragmented identity is providing us with fixated responses, we experience splitting despite any common sense, and our psyche loses plasticity and flexibility. We have two faces. One appears happy and the other is suffering. The happy face placates the addictive behavior and covers weakness. We suppress distressing messages and continue doing the same thing despite our heavy losses. The suffering face provokes internal turmoil. When our fragments are not producing placating responses, we are unhappy. When we are suffering from gambling addiction, we are aware of the incongruity of our oral, visual, and kinesthetic perceptions. We see the similarity between our gambling addiction and unshared love because we have paralyzed asymmetry in perceptions. We use the overused areas to suppress underused fragments. When we are heartbroken from love, we suffer from incongruity in perceptions of our abilities. We continually fall in love with someone who is unable to feel the same way about us. In school, as inexperienced boys, we fall in love with girls who are not attracted to us. We fall in love with a girl who is popular, and unfortunately, she is already in love with someone else. As boys, we are visual and want to impress girls by copying a strong appearance, but it does not work. Girls are impressed by oral messages. For more mature boys, they are not impressed by looks because they have a domineering oral perception. We do not attract girls because we rely on visual impressions, which are mainly underused fragments for them. We are admiring our love as a visual object, but girls are overusing their oral fragments. In many instances, the asymmetry in our perceptions is the cause of our suffering. The remedy for our unshared love and our gambling addiction is the congruency of oral, visual, kinesthetic, and olfactory replies. Common sense requires the congruity of our responses. In many instances, because of the interference of the perceptions of our peers and other factors, our overstimulated fragments lose their domineering role and we restore the congruence to our psyche. We have the strength to resist any temptation and craving when the fixated fragments lose their domineering role. We begin to listen to the underused fragments and stop the destructive behavior. The over-sexualizing and distorted perception. Our over-sexualizing is the result of distorted perceptions in visual, oral, olfactory, tactile, and kinesthetic. The overstimulated fragments attribute sexual activity to the reason of our existence. We carry through all of our life the belief that nothing can be compared to sexual pleasure. As sexual addicts, we feel that sex is the best thing that our life can possibly give us, and we enjoy it by all available means and as often as we can. By overstimulating our fragments with sexual thoughts and feelings of desire, we alter our perception of reality. We have a psychological addiction to pornography, sexually explicit material, sexual gadgets, and replicas of sexual organs. All our sexual infatuations have a base in our overstimulation. In our psyche, we have a fragment of a young child. Conduct of our overstimulated fragment is similar to the behavior of the spoiled kid whose parents showered him with many toys, and now nothing may satisfy his appetite. His room is like a toy store, but he demands more and more possessions. Our behavior as sex addicts is also similar to the behavior of an elderly woman who wants to drink from the fountain of youth. In a weird way, she is sexualizing her life, continuously denying the losses in her appearance and relentlessly suppressing reality. She covers her age like an offender hides his criminal record, and her behavior does not make any sense. The incongruity of her perception exists on her subconscious level because consciously she is not aware of her behavior. Her responses became fixated when she overused the flexibility of her fragments. She suppresses oral and visual information about her age, and when she sees herself in a mirror, she avoids signs of aging and uses selective visual information. She ignores questions about her age because she wants to appear younger, and her movement and reactions become unpredictable. She suppresses age-related messages and losses. Her mannerism is not congruent with her real age, but corresponds more to her imaginative age. She wears the fragrances of a young woman. Her fragments are overused and fixated. She blocks out unpleasant messages of her age, and she suffers from a split in her psyche. The woman may be beautiful for her age, but she still produces incongruity in her perception. She is separating her appearance from her perception. Similarly, as sex addicts, we treat the sex organs separately from the relationship. We move away from human interactions which do not satisfy our desire, and we are infatuated by sexualizing everything around us. Instead of intimacy with a partner, only the sexual act is an object of our desire. The sexual organ becomes a pleasurable toy. The fragments of the spoiled child and the elderly lady become our domineering force, and through overused and overstimulated, fixated fragments, the psyche placates our thoughts. Our thoughts represent the overused fragments. I did well, and many can give up their lives for a night with me. I feel like a millionaire because I kissed him. He is mine, and I am jumping for joy. In meantime, the underused fragment sends an opposite message. I probably have venereal disease. If I get pregnant, I'll kill myself. If my husband finds out, I'll be in trouble. Nevertheless, our underused fragments are weak and cannot stop the sexual addiction. Despite any negative and oral messages, we continue to have the sex addiction. We switch to the visual and kinesthetic forms of interaction and are not concerned with oral messages. The process of overstimulation develops the incongruity in our oral, visual, kinesthetic, and tactile perceptions. We feel the incongruity between our own perception of our ability and the norms that exist in our surroundings. When the internal perception of our abilities is equal to external perception, which comes from the outside world, we achieve a state of equilibrium. To change our faulty perception, we need to have flexibility of our overstimulated fragments. In many instances, the sexual addiction does not make any sense, and the life of the addict is not pleasurable at all. The sex addict is turbulent and always under stress and full of suffering from perceptual distortions. The addict needs to restore congruence in the oral, visual, olfactory, and kinesthetic perceptions to stop the perceptual distortion. The incongruence between our and others' perceptions. The incongruence between our own and other perceptions about our abilities can cause a split in our psyche. The split prevents us from having consent of our ability and from developing a common opinion of our skills. Our split may be intentional or unintentional, and the severity of the split depends on the level of deviation between our own ability and the perception of others. We need to be careful to accept perceptions of others who, without any conscious awareness, split us with only one intention: to feel more powerful. They generate incongruence and confuse us. The majority of splitters consciously do not realize what they're doing. By ridiculing us and ignoring our abilities, they subconsciously want to show their own superiority and higher ability. They do not know they have a strong need to manipulate and to feel powerful. When they are capable of splitting us, they feel good, as if they are on a very important mission that was accomplished. They split us for their own fervent hunger for dominance without any material benefit. They are always searching for an opportunity to split. When splitters finish working on a genius physicist, he was perceived as a moron because he was wearing clothes that did not match by color and his hair was not combed. It is interesting that negativity was damaging for a physicist, but was absolutely not related to his job-related activities. We are asking the self a question: who we really are and what perception about us is correct, because our identity is not strong enough to resist pressure. We feel negative feedback from others and do not get a fair estimation of our abilities. We are confused. In lots of circumstances, the incongruence in perception is very puzzling and causes cracks in our character. The fragmented identity is extremely vulnerable to influences from the outside. The confusion attributes to instability, and when we have an already disjointed identity, we experience a big split. The students in school are graded by teachers and peers, but those evaluations are not always matching. The opinions of teachers and peers can be distinct. Peers are not united in their opinions. We can find respect and admiration from peers who are not in our classes, but we may be the laughingstock in our classes. The situation is very painful for feeble identities because in one place we feel good and supported, but in the other place we feel unsupported and ridiculed. It is comparable to traveling between parallel universes in a dream world. It seems that when we are moving to the discrete place, the perception of others becomes atypical. The incongruence causes a split due to the perceptual incongruence, and we suffer from uncertainty. With solid identities, we are less susceptible to a split. Life in a homogeneous setting is easier. The mainstream environment is too rough and is a test of our strength. Our psyche is vulnerable and the split is noticeable. When we leave the homogeneous setting and get mainstreamed, we can experience a split. In many instances, the weak identities split because of the incongruence between our own perceptions and the perceptions of others. In a heterogeneous environment, the criteria to estimate our abilities depend on an atypical message. In a heterogeneous environment, the criteria to estimate our abilities depend on the atypical opinions of others. The mirror becomes straight and now reflects a twisted image. When in our middle age we are associated with youngsters and want to be like them, we feel that the environment is hostile because the young do not accept us. However, with a solid identity, this pressure is not important because we are very sure about who we are and do not easily get confused. When we live in familiar surroundings, we are less susceptible to split because we are evaluated by more settled norms. When we are in the middle of age and surrounded by others that are close to our own age and interests, we do not feel a big difference in our perception about the self. We also feel mutually in our opinion with the opinions of others. We identify the self with others who are in close proximity, and we do not have any resistance to seeing and interacting with them or accepting any imperfections caused by age. When the environment is homogeneous, the surrounding protects our identity from split. We mirror the others, and the others mirror us. We know our domineering styles. We need to be aware of our domineering styles of expression to be able to plan ahead in our life. Otherwise, we get stuck because in many instances our domineering responses control our life. When we are fearful, anxious, and irritable, and we are surrounded by people who are not calm, we do not feel comfortable. Change our surroundings to be around the fearful, anxious, and irritable. We are protecting the self. Even though the fearfulness, anxiety, and irritability do not support our success, we are happy. We become losers because our life depends on the speed and appropriateness of our decisions. Intuitively, we are scared of our future and are protecting our kinesthetic responses, which are more important because they control all of our functions. To have success in life, we need to restructure our responses. We focus on our strength to feel good and to be sure that we are processing information correctly. In contrast, others judge us by the way we manage our whole life. If we are spending our life struggling to become a singer without a good voice, and we ignore our exceptional abilities to dance, we are choosing a life of unappreciated efforts. The better outcome happens when our domineering functions develop naturally without any struggle. With good visual skills, we can become a successful cinematographer or artist. Our original vision brings a lot of admirers and influences and inspires others. By being a coach in a popular sport, we can lead our team with our kinesthetic abilities. With our skills, we create dependence in others that lack our important talent. It does not matter if those proficiencies are based on our visual, oral, kinesthetic, or olfactory abilities. Without any talents, we spend a lifetime being a student. A lack of those skills damages our self-esteem and stops our life enjoyment. Many of us have a gift, but not everyone can discover it, and we do not always realize our potential. With only a few abilities, we should know our strengths and rely on them. In uncommon styles of expression, we have diverse fragments, and to know our capacity, we always need to be familiar with our dominant moods of expressions. First of all, we depend on the exceptional and outstanding, because we need to know our power and be aware of our giftedness. We are rating the self by our profound understanding of the subject and the quality of our responses. If we choose one of our functions to be domineering, then we program the other functions to be servants. In many instances, the gift can be a burden. When we have several distinguished qualities, we need to choose one of them to be a dominating one. It is great to have many talents, but paradoxically, if we only have one, we have a better chance to achieve success. Any of us has a chance to be good at something, but our abilities are not equal and are like the cards received from the dealer in the card games that provide us with unique attitudes in life. Some of us receive the upper hand without much, but others who give an enormous attempt struggle. When we have the upper hand, we play only to win, but otherwise we play not to lose a game. It is easier to play with the upper hand, but with small cards, we can enjoy the game too. We cannot find the self exceptionable, but we prove the self as loving parents. By providing the needed love and care, we raise a child to be very happy. As gifted individuals may not be the best parents because we are invested too much in our work and do not spend enough time with the family. We cannot be everything. To realize the self, we must plan ahead by knowing that our future will depend on our domineering qualities. We are driven forward by our talent and reach for our unique life. The tactile experience. The tactile experience is very important because through it, we can understand our responses. If we are not consciously aware of how our touch affects others, then we are ignoring how others respond to our touch. It is impossible to count how many times we are emotionally touching others and getting touched. When we are not connected with others, or even with our own bodies, we become completely ignorant of ours and others' responses. The way we touch others and respond to touches become evident to our identity. Our reactions to touch mirror the fragmentation process in our psyche. When the shy and emotionally reserved fragments take over the psyche, we avoid any touch because for us it is not pleasure. With emotionally sensitive, domineering fragments in our inventory, we are very sensitive to touch. The touch may create a lot of emotions that we can't handle. Our straightforward and less sensitive fragments do not show any special reaction to the touch, but can be sensitive to tickling. If we sexualize all touches, including those that are not of a sexual nature, we feel sexual arousal when we've been touched. Depending on our attitude towards sex, the sexualizing is a sign of splitting in the areas of pleasure and shame. In contrast, if we are fearful of touch, it is because the touch triggers pain and vigilant feelings when we were angry or traumatized. Touch can be energizing and paralyzing. After an energized touch, we feel refreshed and aroused, but after a paralyzing touch, we feel empty and powerless. Our nervousness and irritability associate with our tension as well as tactile discomfort. We have inconsistent responses to touch when we are hyper and impulsive. Sometimes we overreact and show our intense reaction, but at other times we are lethargic and show a very low response. When we are inattentive and depressed, we exhibit our inconsistent responses, and our dominant responses are the feelings of oppression that hold back our secondary responses. We have a propensity to be manipulated and get easily victimized by others. When we are depressed, our translation of information is wrong. We make our responses very predictable when we produce a similar response to a variety of unrelated stimulations. We have anger or sexual responses to stimulations that are not intended to be offensive or sexual. We get tearful and sad from a touch that does not have any resemblance to the painful experience. We can also get numb and detached from any contacts, or be susceptible to sweet talk or embraces. Our confused fragments are predisposed to suggestions, and we are manipulated by flattery and hugs that appear sincere. The advertising industry uses the knowledge of our responses, and we use many hugs and pleasurable touches in ads. To resist manipulation from others, the media, the environment, and our own fragments, we need to know our reactions, and which are triggered by tactile experiences. Our incongruity is confusing. The stimulations with incongruity between oral and visual perceptions are confusing. The casinos attract us by using confusion. They design the games to bamboozle our domineering modalities. It may explain why we continue to gamble despite big losses. When we enter the casinos, we see the gambling machines, which appear to be fascinating. Casino's environment creates a misleading message with the noise of the falling money from slot machines, which are just the promises, but not an indication of gambling success. In the meantime, on the screens, the slot machines display movement and bright objects, which can be sequential or random. They affect our visual responses, having a hypnotic effect in diminishing our resistance to losses. When it becomes clear that luck is not on our side, the skillful design of the unusual moments or movements on the screen of the slot machines takes away our concentration of losses and gives us an unexpected sensation of winning. We experience false hopes. After the losses, the comforting noise of falling money and figures on the screen restore the feelings of comfort, and the seductive sounds and movements smother the fact that we are in heavy loss. The environment of confusion and false hopes is responsible for the paradox that we do not leave the gambling activity even after significant losses. The slot machine gamblers are addicted to the game in the same way as children. The knob of the slot machine becomes a joystick. We push the spin button with increased speed and experience the excitement of being on a ride. The greed is not a dominating part of our gambling addiction. As gamblers, we do not benefit much monetarily from our addictions, nor do we feel good about the self. We put our loved ones through a financial burden and tremendous stress to tolerate our impulsiveness. We are usually in denial of our problems and do not accept the fact that we are weak and powerless in the face of our impulses. We suffer incongruity of our oral, visual, and kinesthetic expressions, and we are good candidates to become addicted to slot machines and table games. We can apparently have developed oral, visual, kinesthetic expressions, but as a system, they do not attune and are disarranged. Our single demonstration of expression can be very good, but altogether the representation is out of balance and needs alignment. The misalignment influences our psyche to split, creating chemical imbalance. Our vehemence and vigor during the games is also a sign of the split. Our system can be realigned after the removal of the influences, and the split may be resolved. Addiction to table games is not distinct from our addiction to the slot machines. In the table games, we are also impulsive and addicted to the extremes, but we act more independently. We are driven by a desire to fulfill the excitement and to experience repeated feelings of risk. We are very spontaneous, and because of our gambling addiction, we can also have an alcohol or drug problem, or even an addiction to sex. Our impulsiveness pushes us to act without considering logical consequences. The protective areas of our brain are suppressed and are not functioning properly. In other words, the impulsiveness causes incongruence in our brain in the area of sensory perceptions, and deficiency in the processing of the oral, visual, and kinesthetic stimulations is a symptom. Our psyche is split. The split from our sensory perceptions. We mirror someone else's sensory perceptions when our fragments split. Our dominant fragments usually have a ruling sensor, which is consistent with the developmental needs of our psyche. As a result of trauma, our fragments split disproportionately from the visual, kinesthetic, olfactory, tactile, and oral sensory bases. Our perceptions become unclear because our domineering fragments are not fair to our minor fragments. We are not sensitive enough to the fragments that pinpoint dissimilar sensory bases. Our visual fragments can be insensitive to the fragments that are part of the oral and kinesthetic sensory base, and vice versa. Based on the different sensory bases, our fragments perceive reality in a contradictory way. We are in disagreement about our feelings and do not express any compassion to our sufferings. But if we translate our altered reality to the other senses, our feelings become more acceptable by our other sensory bases. The translation of our experiences allows our fragments to understand and relate better. With translation, we analyze the other frames of reference of our experience. Our diversely framed expressions provide many new clues, allowing us to understand them and to have compassion. It is similar to soldiers from different military branches that fight in the same battle, but may not feel the same compassion to fellow soldiers in dissimilar uniforms. By using translation, we do not compromise the validity of our experience because the expression of the experience is not bound by only one frame. After the trauma, we need the translation of our experience to other sensors because otherwise we can split into an opposite perception that is not ours, but that is influenced and introduced from the outside. As victims, we suffer from very strong visual perceptions and have flashbacks. We also have kinesthetic reactions, which include very aversive kinesthetic responses. It is complicated to receive pleasure, to relax, and to engage in sexual play. We have perceived painful stimulations of the tactile, and as a result, we get very sensitive or insensitive to touch. As victims of rape, we have many painful reactions. We can over-sexualize all aspects of our life, or we can suffer from religious, persecutory hallucinations that are inflicted by feelings of fear and guilt. We become very sensitive to oral stimulations. We need to survive in our non-domineering fragments split from the main structure. Our separation has a variety of reasons, but because of pain, we do not care much about anything. We do not have any reason to preserve unification, and we lose the main reason of unification, to protect ourselves. After the trauma, we may use drugs and alcohol. Our fragments split from the present sensory base, become dissimilar, and they are not a representation of the self anymore. They represent a structure that is not needed and was abandoned a long time ago. We emerge as a new part of a domineering system which is dysfunctional and needs alcohol and drugs to keep us going. After the trauma, our psyche becomes unstable and unpredictable, and then the question arises, who are we? After extreme troubles, we abandon our own responses and mirror our fixated responses, which push us away from our flexible perceptions and cause an arrival of the false self. The process of splitting the self may be repetitive, but it has no limits and keeps us in constant turmoil. When extreme stress interrupts our normal development, it is harmful to us and we may split. To satisfy our developmental needs, the new system of domineering fragments detaches from the old system so that our stressful experience is not needed. It is comparable with the change in the ruling structure when the new authorities do not want anything to do with the previous one. Our new structure forms, and the old structure continues to function in opposition, hiding like rebels in the mountains and doing guerrilla raids, for a short time, taking over our psyche. Our splitting from the old structure has been caused by discontent, lack of support, not enough emotional nurturing, and neglect of other developmental needs. The fixated fragments fewed inside our psyche are an indication of the split, the lack of plasticity and the harsh conditions of our structure. Our fragments fewed because of addiction, mental illness, and character problems. Within many of our fragments, we have a few with destructive abnormalities like addictions and mental illness. Those fragments share our life and we treat them with respect and dignity. We solidify all of our fragments, including the fragments that appear dissimilar and have atypical experiences. As a result, they produce congruent responses. Some of our diverse stimulations test the stability of our psyche. When fragments exhibit destructive tendencies, our domineering majority is always ready to have a dialogue or at least negotiate. We do not dismiss those responses as nuances. When some of our fragments create fearful responses about danger, we acknowledge the validity of the fragment's concern about our safety, assuring the fearful fragments in self-talk that we are doing everything to take care of the danger. Our real gains are by calming the fearful fragments, which reduce stress. All of the fragments benefit from the lessening of tension. The job of integrating our loosely associated fragments to a solid system requires consistent effort. We must bring rigid fragments to our conscious awareness and understand them, helping them to be aware of how they benefit our wholeness. We gently take care of our dysfunctional fragments which are not actively participating in the integration process. We are sensitive to how the less functional fragments react, and we have the responsibility and knowledge of how to properly deal with them. We do not push and humiliate our sick and dysfunctional fragments. If one of our fragments has uncontrolled cravings, then our other fragments use self-talk and get involved in the negotiation. We clarify the consequences for breaking our sobriety, finding activities to direct us away from our cravings. We repeat our goals and the benefits of sobriety. When we withdraw from the substance, we become aware that withdrawals require medical monitoring and medical intervention, and that we are taking a risk if we do it all of our own. During the withdrawal process, together with the medical monitoring, psychological support of our fragments is very important. A similar situation will arise if we are mentally ill. We need our medications because our mental illness requires medical compliance. It is not enough effort to take a few medications for a limited time. Our mental illness is a lifelong illness and needs long-term treatment. The other fragments help us to get better by using dialogue and negotiation. Many of our interventions cause improvement when we integrate our psyche into the whole identity. The split of identity disables our capacity and tightens our internal resources. The function of the splitting identity is to produce more splitting and other fragmentation, and to challenge our stability. The splitting is associated with manipulation and confrontation. If our splitting is not stopped by the process of unification, the cycle does not have limits and continues forever. The temptation to use. When our urge to use the substance suppresses our previous promises to stay sober, we detach from feelings of discomfort, from breaking the abstinence, and from upsetting our significant others. As addicts, we rely on the part of the brain that supports our urges and temptations. Our olfactory sensor is very powerful and is a supporter of our addiction and creates strong cravings. It is superior to our visual, oral, and kinesthetic messages. Kinesthetic, oral, and visual messages oppose and resist our urges. Our resistance to used is suppressed by our olfactory stimulations, and our temptations continue to be very strong. The fixated fragments support our urges and allow us to drink alcohol or use drugs without resistance until we become impaired. Our level of indulgence of alcohol is considered abnormal by kinesthetic measurements, which consist of our incorrect execution of movements, our rhythm of breathing, and our incorrect pronunciation of words. Our fixated kinesthetic fragments become collaborators and enablers. To satisfy our urges, we listen to our internal pre-recorded messages. The oral messages keep together according our general mental condition and are based on responses of our fragments. Without internal and external support, it is much harder to achieve relief from the temptations and to resist our urges. The prolonged resistance to our temptation works in reverse and increases the strength of our urges. In contrast, our destructive tendencies mobilize all possible supports from the submissive fragments, and our urges to use the substance have many supporters. We suppress our unpleasant oral, kinesthetic, and visual messages, which encourage us to resist temptations. We glorify the indulgence in using. Without support of others, our urges become uncontrollable and we break our sobriety. The group of an addict is organized spontaneously. When we are users, we keep to the rules of the group. The messages of the group infect us like a parasite and spread. The group can consist only of a few members or just one, who distributes the group's messages and constantly looks forward to enroll new members. As addicts, we can be estranged from others and operate alone, but the influence of the group continues to be with us. As group members, we insinuate that sobriety creates a very dull lifestyle and takes out all the fun and friendships from our life. We stress that others who are not part of our group do not know what is good or bad, and only the group knows the real truth. We block the messages which imply it is very wrong to use the substance. Our visual messages support our usage, and we caution others that they are not intimidated by the messages against the use of the substance. We submissively recall the faces of our drinking buddies, which are dear friends, and the pleasurable sexual encounters accompanied by alcohol consumption. Those visual messages increase the craving because we attribute the pleasurable memory to the substance enjoyment. The messages are about using the substance is pleasure. The group mentality supports the craving and constantly pushes us to break sobriety, working against our resistance. The neutral fragments support addiction. Our psychological addiction is so durable because our pleasurable association is attributed to the use of the substance. A few of our fragments are neutral to the cravings but later become supporters of the addiction. The power of addiction is in our desire to change our reality and to experience a feeling of euphoria. We cannot tolerate any unpleasantness, stressful events, and painful encounters that bring a high level of discomfort. The benefits of substance abuse are in the transformation of reality. After using the substance, our feelings switch from discomfort to comfort. Our fixated fragments, which are in opposition to the unpleasant reality, push us to have cravings and break sobriety. Because of the common goals, the neutral fragments do not oppose it. Negativity to the existing unlikable reality pushes the neutral fragments to support the substance use together with domineering fragments. They become supporters and are in opposition to other fragments that do not want to change the existing reality. The dominant fragments of our psyche split from the fragments that are against substance abuse. Our distraction of opposition to used substances happens on a subconscious level. When we bring all of our conflicts to the conscious level, we are more prepared to fight cravings, and then we are consciously aware of our internal processes and can achieve success in resisting urges. We understand that it is not very wise to change the unpleasant reality to addiction, and we empower our neutral fragments to resist the cravings. We identify and translate the stimulation of cravings to the centers of opposition, and we clear confusion in our responses, translating our olfactory sense, which creates craving, to our kinesthetic expression. Our opposition to addiction decreases our craving. The new messages are that we will lose coordination when we use the substance. We translate the smell of the substance as the distortions and as blurring in the eyes. All of those discomforts are real, and we do not support this temptation. They emphasize the unpleasant consequences of using the substance. By translating stimulations to other modalities, we reinforce the opposition and advance forward in the struggle against using the substance. We win over time. Our confrontation with craving can be done on the conscious level of awareness if we willfully and consciously oppose the pleasurable attributions to substance abuse. To win the struggle against forces of craving, we must use all means at our disposal. We mobilize and solidify the obtainable fragments, and in dialogues, we prevent the suppression of the reality. By unifying against our cravings, we build opposition and enroll the neutral fragments on our side because they are the valuable parts of our psyche. The outcome of the struggle between our domineering fragments and the opposition depends on our skills and how successfully we require the cooperation of neutral fragments. If done right, we can transform the fixation to plasticity. We have only a few ways to deal with our cravings. We can give in to cravings and then suppress our dissent and continue using the substance as we did before. To stop cravings, we must reinforce our opposition to its use. To achieve a victory over the forces of cravings, our opposition needs to be stronger than the power of the craving. Only if a majority of neutral fragments help us will we become successful in stopping the cravings.